Welcome to this week's episode of the Inside Kingston Podcast, where experienced professionals, entrepreneurs and community leaders based in Kingston upon Thames are invited on to share their story with us. I'm your host, Amyr Rocha-Lima.
This week's episode of the Inside Kingston Podcast is brought to you by Holland Hahn and Wills, a financial planning and wealth management firm based in Kingston upon Thames. Holland Hahn and Wills specialises in retirement planning for senior professionals and successful business owners. Visit hhw-uk.com to start feeling more relaxed and confident about your financial future.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Inside Kingston Podcast. I'm joined today by the Worshipful the Mayor of the Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames, Councillor Margaret Thompson. Councillor Thompson qualified as a paediatric nurse and has held a variety of specialist posts in hospitals and in our community. What's unique about Councillor Thompson is her perspective on human resilience, having witnessed how, with the right support, looked after children can grow past their own difficulties. And be sure to listen to the end, where Councillor Thompson shares with us a line from a beautiful Dylan Thomas poem. So if you're interested in knowing more about our current mayor, then I hope you enjoy this episode of the Inside Kingston Podcast. The Worshipful the Mayor of the Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames, Councillor Margaret Thompson, welcome to the Inside Kingston Podcast. Madam Mayor, I'm really excited about this conversation because, well, I'm interested in knowing more about the Mayor's duties and how you promote all that our borough has to offer. And I think our listeners would love to learn more about this from you too. But to kick off this conversation, I'd like to go back in time if that's okay. So, Madam Mayor, where did you grow up?
I grew up until my late teens in Caterham in Surrey, not actually terribly far from Kingston. And then my family moved to Lancashire, Lytham in Lancashire, which is a really lovely seaside town. And they lived there until my parents died. And so I spent my older, as it were, young years in Lytham. But in fact, although I was brought up in Caterham, not soon after the family moved up to Lytham, I did in fact move back to London to undertake my nurse training.
Oh, wow. So is that what you studied as sort of formal studies?
Yes, by trade I am a nurse. I undertook my first lot of nurse training, as it were, at the Hospital for Sick Children, Great Ormond Street, and also undertook a year's training at University College Hospital in order to qualify as both a paediatric and a general nurse. But then I had a fairly varied career. I moved from the Hospital for Sick Children up to Manchester, where I was sister in charge of an intensive care unit for newborn babies who needed surgery in the first week or so of life.
Wow.
And I then became a nurse teacher and I taught nurses in a school of nursing in Manchester. I then moved back down to Kent, where I was the senior nurse in charge of a paediatric unit, a number of wards, outpatients and so on. But then I got married and I had my own children, and that put a bit of a stop to the career as such. So I just did bank work as such at Queen Mary Hospital in Roehampton. But at that time, I also took my first degree in health and then moved into school health and my second degree in community health and became a school nurse for a while in Kingston and in East Surrey. And I moved from there to become Kingston's first community nurse specialist for looked after children. In other words, children looked after by the local authority. But all the way through my career, I have had the nurse's problem, recurrent issues with the back. And after a particularly grueling episode and also an accident to my arm, eventually I had to give that up and was retired from the health service as unfit to work anymore on ill health retirement, which was a huge, huge blow, as you can imagine.
I bet. Yeah. Well, firstly, I applaud you for obviously undertaking that noble profession throughout your whole career. My own children, thankfully, were born healthy, but my little girl had some allergies when she was born, and the nursing team at West Middlesex Hospital that helped us were just unbelievable, and we held them very close to our hearts. So it's a noble profession indeed. And you're absolutely right. And if you don't mind, I'm going to call you Margaret. The role, especially this profession with regards to healthcare in the main, I find that those professionals typically associate a big part of their life with what they do. So who they are with what they do. And is that how, from your comment, how you felt when you dissociated from being Margaret the nurse?
Yes, I think for many healthcare people, doctors, nurses, all the other professionals associated with medicine, like ambulance people and so on, radiographers, you sometimes feel it's that the whole caring ethos, the whole NHS ethos, if you like, is written through you like a stick of Blackpool rock. You know, that it is a fundamental part of you. And so it's all bound up with who you are and how you think and what you do. And to me, the whole glory of our health service is the fact that everybody will be treated exactly the same. If you're President Trump, you might get a fancier room and you might get nicer food and this kind of thing, but the actual medical care you get will be the same as if you were a homeless person. And I think that is the huge glory of the health service. It doesn't always work, but it does its best to be absolutely fair and equitable in its treatment of everybody.
Absolutely. That's fascinating. Margaret, what got you into politics in the first place, and how did that lead you to becoming the mayor?
That's an interesting one. I became a school governor, actually, about 30 years ago, pushing 30 years ago. And I was a local authority governor, which meant I had to decide to be affiliated, if you like, not a member of, but just appointed by one of the local political parties. That doesn't happen anymore. Local authority governors, if they still exist, and they don't in many places, do not have to be appointed by a particular local authority, a particular political party. But I decided to become affiliated to the party that I thought were most represented my values, as it were. I wasn't a member. I didn't need to be a member, but I was appointed by them. Later on, I got to know our local councillors quite well because they were friends and neighbours, and I was interested in what they did, and I represented one of them at a by-election as her agent. That was really, really interesting, finding out how local governance works and what it does and how involved it is in people's lives and the good it can do. And so these two councillors were consistently badgering me to stand for council. But I just didn't have time. I was working, I was studying, 3 children. I just did not have time. But then, as I said, I lost my job. The children grew up and started to be not need me at all. My husband works quite long hours, is often away. But that didn't matter because the children were pretty much adult or had left home. And so I thought I would give it a try. So I stood for election the first time in 2010 and was elected, and then again in 2014 and 2018.
That's fantastic. And that spirit of getting involved in the local community is something that is very much behind this very small project in the Inside Kingston podcast. And I'm guessing it gives you a completely different vision of the borough, the beauties, some of the problems, some of the things that we can try to all get together to add value to.
Yes, I think in local governance, local councillors, whatever their political stripe, doesn't really matter. They generally all want the best for their local residents, and we challenge each other as political opponents, but it is, generally speaking, in the interests of our local residents. And different people have different ideas on how to get to where we want to get to, but the final aim is pretty much always the same, the best possible outcome for people who live locally to us. And because I have been very involved in the local area in many ways for many years, it meant that I already knew quite a lot of people and were familiar with a lot of local organisations and this kind of thing. So it was a very, very interesting change to then become the local councillor, to represent people rather more than just being part of them.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Now, Kingston, of course, has so much history, but to you, what is it about the area that makes it so special?
Well, of course, much of it is the history. I came to Kingston by mistake, if you like, and have just stayed because it is such a welcoming place. It's a beautiful place. There's so much green. There is so much activity. There is so much to do. And it does have a real sense of place and a sense of community. It doesn't feel like a suburb of London. It feels like somewhere in its own right, which I think is particularly important. I never thought I would end up living in Kingston. I can tell you how I got here, if you like. That was one of the questions you thought you might ask. But I didn't ever think I would end up settling here. It's yeah. Well, I was working in Manchester, as I said. I was teaching in a school of nursing. I'd had some more surgery on my spine. And a close friend, invited me to be the bridesmaid at her wedding. She, at that time, worked in a community for people with mental health problems. And she also had a friend who came to work there during the long vacation from university. So I went to her wedding to be her bridesmaid, and the other friend went to the wedding to be the organist. So that is how my husband and I met. He was the organist and I was the bridesmaid. So that's not cheesy or anything.
Very good.
We spent the next 18 months or so travelling up and down the motorway between Manchester and Kingston. And then we decided that perhaps it would work after all. And so I moved to Kent and we got married. And that is how I ended up in Kingston, because at the time he was working at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington. He is a physicist.
Oh, fantastic.
And
that's really interesting story.
I failed physics at GCE. And he is now the professor of experimental physics at Imperial College. So we are not well matched in terms of...
Well matched in other areas, though, I'm sure.
Well, we have been married for 35 years now, so it doesn't seem to have mattered too much.
Congratulations. That's really beautiful. Now, Margaret, you're switching gears on you slightly, if you don't mind. Your chosen charities are the Kingston Centre for Independent Living and Oxygen. Could you tell us a little bit more about their work in our community?
Yes, I chose those two charities because they are smallish local charities that do a fantastic amount of work on a shoestring, are very tuned into their local communities, know them well and serve them very well. And they both have a significant number of volunteers and they work very, very hard. KCIL, Kingston Centre for Independent Living, is a charity that supports people who have physical disabilities. Mainly, some may have mental health problems too, or learning difficulties, but mainly physical disabilities, to enable them to live their best life possible and to fulfill their potential as much as possible. And it does this by offering grants for holidays if necessary, because if you are disabled and you want to go on holiday, it's hugely expensive and stressful and difficult. And many disabled people don't have a holiday for years. And the other thing it does is offer grants for equipment, because, again, the NHS, as I said before, is just brilliant, but doesn't always have the resources to offer people the kind of aids that make their day-to-day lives significantly better. But one of the main things it does, one of the most important things, is to guide people through the maze of bureaucracy. So it helps with filling in forms, with claiming the independence payments that people are entitled to and the benefits they're entitled to. And it also helps people to find the personal assistance they need in order to live their lives as fully as possible. Because many people, disabled people, do not necessarily have the help and the resources at home to do this for them. And so by undertaking this work, it frees people up to find the best possible way of living their lives as independently as possible. And I have to say, the people I have had the privilege of meeting through KCIL have been really feisty people who are hugely determined and who do not let their disabilities get in the way of living their lives as freely and openly as possible. I have huge admiration for them. And I think that KCIL does a massive amount of very, very good work for people who often get overlooked and left at the edge of society, if you like, sort of marginalised people. And it does a huge amount to bring them back into the mainstream where they belong.
Fantastic. And how about Oxygen? What sort of work do they do in the community?
Oxygen looks after a different group of people. It works mainly with young people. This is, well, all together with young people. This is people, youngsters aged from about 10 through to early 20s. And it helps them, again, to live their lives as well as possible, but in a way that keeps them out of trouble, if you like, helps young people whose lives maybe haven't been very kind to them, who don't necessarily have the kind of family background, or who've made some unwise choices. Helps them through that. And it helps kind of young people that people often look at and think, oh, I don't want to sit next to him on the bus. But it helps kind of young people who may not be regarded very well by society, but it keeps them out of trouble, helps them to understand that they are worthy human beings who can contribute, make a useful contribution to the world, be a part of society, be respected for who they are. And it really, really does a lot of good work with youngsters. It does this by running youth projects. There's the Man and Boy project. There's other projects which it runs to try and help young people. There are youth groups and youth activities it runs. And it also is having a great influence, actually, recently on knife crime and the prevention of knife crime. And its project there, called What's the Point, has actually gained national notice, and the leaders of Oxygen have been speaking to government ministers and so on about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And they, again, have had a great deal of influence. But again, it's small, it's local. The leaders of it live locally. They run their projects locally, and they have their outcomes evaluated, and they are all very, very positive. The Homework Club is another thing. It runs clubs after school for young people who may not have anywhere to do their homework. And by running clubs for these young people, it helps them to maintain their academic prowess. It keeps children in school, helps to keep them learning. So it does a great deal of good.
Margaret, what are some of the key lessons you've learned throughout your life?
I think just the huge variety and interest of humans, of people, how diverse we all are, and yet how similar we all are. Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet, wrote what I think are some of the most humane words in the English language when he wrote, "We are not wholly bad or good who live our lives under milk wood." And you can tell we are not wholly bad or good who choose to live our lives in Kingston, or to live our lives as local politicians, or to live our lives in any other way. We are human, and we need to respect that in all of us. And that, I think, is the biggest lesson I have learned, the need to respect and to be courteous to each other, and to listen to each other, to try and understand where the other person is coming from, what shaped them, not to be judgmental.
Absolutely. And I very much second Dylan Thomas. I think his words are just beautiful. His poem, "Do not go gentle into that good night," is
good night. I think rage against the dying of the light is something that we can all live up to. And not just referring to death either, referring to the dying of the light in terms of democracy, or in terms of lack of education, or in terms of poverty, in terms of our young people. There's a whole host of ways in which we can think about that.
Yeah. And Margaret, what I really like about that is that local governance or local politics at the micro level that we have been talking about today really gives people in the community a chance to just try to be part of something bigger than themselves that affects the community around them. I love that idea. Britain was built on volunteers and built on people getting involved in their local community. So I think that's the biggest lesson out of that side is get involved. Get involved. Why not?
Why not? Yeah.
When you look back at your career journey to date, what are you most proud of?
I think in terms of my nursing career, I think my last role as nurse specialist for looked after children was probably the most difficult, because it is just heartbreaking to see young people whose lives have just not been kind to them. But also taught me a very great deal about the resilience of the human spirit, and the different ways in which people can express themselves and grow past these problems and these issues. So I think being part of that, at the time it was a developing role. It's now much more widespread all over the country, and the job that the current nurses undertake is very different to the one that I undertook, because I was starting from scratch and making it up as I went along, in a sense. But I am pleased about that I was able to be part of the start of that journey. I think that's one of the things I am most proud of. Yeah.
That's fantastic. What next for the Mayor's office? Are there any projects in the pipeline that you can tell us about?
Yes. Yes, there are. Of course, this is my second year in the mayoralty, which is very unusual. Most mayors do a year, but because of the COVID and various things, I was asked to take a second year. So I've been doing this all online, as indeed we are now. I have been to very few actual engagements. I've been to a handful, but mainly I have been doing this online. One of the projects we have is related to my charities, and that is the mobile mop-up. And we launched this last year in order to support my charities, but it was, of course, cut short because of COVID. And so we are relaunching it later on this year and after Christmas in waves. And what this is working with a local firm called Genuine Solutions UK, who have very, very kindly, we worked out this project last year, and they are very kindly supporting us hugely through this. We are collecting disused, unwanted mobile phones, and the company is recycling them or refurbishing them and then giving my charities the profits, which is a massive undertaking for the firm and has worked very well. We raised over £4,000 last year doing this. Wow. And it was, I say, cut short. This is really important in two ways. One is because it raises money for the charities. The other thing is that GSUK disposes of all the chemical, either reuses absolutely everything that can be reused or recycled. And anything that can't be reused or recycled is disposed of completely ethically. What that means is that the amount of chemicals and other components of mobile phones, precious metals and so on, that have to be dug out of the ground in countries whose regulations about child labour, for instance, may not be as strict as ours, is reduced. And so it has a very big impact on the reduction of having to mine these chemicals and these metals. It also speaks to the green agenda because it is all recycling and reusing. And of course, it raises money. So it's three really good things. And as a byline, it raises money for the charities without anybody actually having to give me any money. And people don't have much money at the moment, especially during the pandemic. But many people have old mobile phones lying around at home. And so I would just put a plea out. If you have any old mobile phones, I will go anywhere to collect them.
That's a wonderful project. I definitely second that. And I myself will have a look at old drawers to see if we can find any mobile phones, Margaret. That's brilliant.
Thank you. As we start to just contact the Mayor's office. That's all you need to do.
Absolutely. As we start to wrap up, I'd like to ask you a few quick fire questions that our listeners are always interested in. So, Margaret, what do you do to relax outside of the office?
My greenhouse is my happy place. When I first got married, we had a garden. We moved into a house with a garden. I didn't have a clue what to do with it, so I thought I'd better find out. I went to do a terms course in gardening. I ended up doing the entire City and Guild certificate in gardening, and that is where I really like to be, is outside in the greenhouse or just outside in the garden. And I just like growing things. So, yeah, that's what I like to do.
Are there any books that you've recently read that you'd recommend to our listeners?
I read all the time. I'm an absolutely avid reader, and I knew you were going to ask me this, so I had to look at our many bookshelves. And actually, I found it really hard to pick any out. My books are like my old friends, and sometimes I like to go back to books I love and reread them. I do like reading different kinds of poetry. I like that very much. I'm currently reading Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, the recent Booker Prize winner. I have to confess, I never got on with Hilary Mantel, so I've tried 3 times to start her epic sagas, but I've actually never managed to complete them. But I will. I am determined. A book I read, which my entire family really enjoyed because then we all listened to it together as an audiobook, was The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. That's a really remarkable book. I think, actually, I did make a list of these books, but there is just so many. But no, books, I think, are just an important part of life, really. And The Book Thief was another book that had a profound impact on me. I do quite like the Golden Age fiction, Marjorie Allingham and so on. I really enjoy that. And I do enjoy reading social history, not so much kings and queens type history, but social history of Britain, and not just Britain, but around the world as well. And then marrying up the different periods in different places so that you get an overall view of history and you're not just confined to one place and one time. So I haven't named very many actual books, but that's because there are just so many.
That's fascinating. And are there any movies or TV shows that you've recently watched that you'd recommend to our listeners?
Most of my evenings are filled up with meetings and that. I don't really get to see very many television programmes or films, I have to say. But I did enjoy watching Parasite, which of course won the award, whose name has completely escaped me at the moment.
The Oscar, I think.
The Oscar, that was it. Yep. Won the Oscar. I did really enjoy that because, again, of the lessons about the resilience of the human spirit it showed us. I did enjoy that. And just recently, I have been watching Us, the 4-part on ITV, on BBC, which finished just yesterday, day before yesterday. And the reason I've enjoyed that is because it's quite a gentle and nuanced story of middle age, which is often not presented in a very gentle or nuanced way. And I think that was an interesting program on many levels, and it had Tom Hollander in it, so that recommends it anyway. Yeah.
You're the second person that mentions that show, so I'm definitely going to put it on my to-watch list and check it out myself, so thank you for that. Finally, where can people go to find out more about you and the Mayor's office?
They can email the Mayor's office, or they can look on the council website. The mayoralty in Kingston has a really long and interesting history, and the whole of Kingston has a fascinating history. I mean, from the mayor's parlour, I can pretty much see the coronation stone, which is where our 7 Saxon kings were crowned more than 1,000 years ago. Kingston is the oldest royal borough. It's older than any other royal boroughs by about 1,000 years because it was backdated. In 1923, its status as a royal borough was confirmed. And it was confirmed from time immemorial, which means it was placed before Kensington and Chelsea, which was actually made into a royal borough about 5 years earlier. But Kingston's is from time immemorial. So we are the oldest royal borough. We have such a rich history, and that rich history permeates what we do today. So, and that is what I see history as building on what has gone in the past and developing it into the future. And all of our residents of Kingston who work and live and learn in Kingston have a part in that history. They're all part of it.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention it that way, because I've always found it interesting to walk over to the ancient market to grab lunch during work week, and then think how many people over so many centuries have basically walked these streets to buy something here at this market. It's just great to think that, you know.
If you walked up the towpath from Hampton Court because you were a servant in the time of Thomas Cromwell or whatever, and you'd walked up the towpath and you'd gone to the Druids Inn, which was there then, and you'd walked up one of those little passages which were there then into the marketplace, and you'd looked at the church and you'd looked at the market house and many of the other buildings, you would know exactly where you were today, which I think is just wonderful. And we have that. We have so much history, and we have so much, we almost take it for granted because we've just got such a lot. And of course, the river has been absolutely fundamental in developing Kingston as such an interesting and historic place. Our maces, the Mayor's maces, which are carried in front of the Mayor on formal occasions, are the oldest in constant use in the country. They date from 1617.
It's fascinating stuff. The area is definitely full of history. And, for the benefit of our listeners, I'll make sure that in the show notes, I point them to the Mayor's website so that they can have a look at some of these resources for themselves.
Yes, please do. Please do. It is fascinating.
Madam Mayor, thank you for joining us here on the Inside Kingston podcast. It's been a pleasure getting to know your story.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you.
That wraps up another episode of the Inside Kingston podcast. Make sure to check out our guests' website, pay them a visit, and help spread the word about what they're doing. If you have any questions or know someone who should be a guest on the show, please feel free to get in touch. I would also love it if you could go to iTunes and leave us a review and a 5-star rating. We work hard to bring on some great guests, and getting a review from you is one way to help the podcast rate well on iTunes so that others can find and enjoy the show too. Thanks for listening.